Modern Man in Search of a Soul, written by C.G. Jung and translated by W.S. Dell and Carrie F. Baines. This audiobook is based on a series of lectures from Carl Jung, first published in 1933. Translator's Preface. Within the last decade, there have been many references from varied sources to the fact that the Western world stands on the verge of a spiritual rebirth. That is, a fundamental change of attitude toward the values of life. After a long period of outward expansion, we are beginning to look within ourselves once more. There is a very general agreement as to the phenomena surrounding this increasing shift of interest from facts as such to their meaning and value to us as individuals. But as soon as we begin to analyze the anticipations nursed by the various groups in our world with respect to the change that is to be hoped for, agreement is at an end, and a sharp conflict of forces makes itself felt. By those who uphold revealed religion, the rebirth that seems imminent is thought of as a renaissance of Catholicism or Protestantism, as the case may be. They see mankind streaming by the million back to the bosom of the Church, there to be comforted for the disillusionments and disasters of our post-war world, there to be taught the paths that will lead out of chaos. Renewal of faith in Christianity, they say, will bring us back to a sure way of life and restore the inspiration the world has lost. Another great group of people think that the new attitude is to be attained by the total destruction of religion, as it has up to now been understood. Religion is, they say, a relic of superstitious barbarism, and in its place must come a new and lasting period of enlightenment. Let man but apply his knowledge in the right way, especially his knowledge of economics and technology, and all the great bogies of poverty, ignorance, greed, etc., will vanish into thin air, and man will be restored to his lost paradise. To them, the rebirth is to be in the realm of reason alone, and the intellect becomes the arbiter of man's fate. Between these two extremes of traditional faith and militant rationalism, every conceivable shade of opinion about this great problem of humanity's next step in psychic evolution is to be found. It may be said that the middle position is held by those people who know that they have outgrown the Church as exemplified in Christianity, but who have not therefore been brought to deny the fact that a religious attitude to life is as essential to them as a belief in the authenticity of science. These people have experienced the soul as vividly as the body as vividly as the soul, and the soul has manifested itself to them in ways not to be explained in terms either of traditional theology or of materialism. They do not wish to sever the real piety they feel within themselves from the body of scientific fact to which reason gives its sanction. They are convinced that if they can attain to more knowledge of the inner workings of their own minds, more information about the subtle but nonetheless perfectly definite laws that govern the psyche, they can achieve the new attitude that is demanded without having on the one hand to regress to what is but a thinly veiled medieval theology, or on the other to fall victims to the illusions of 19th century ideology. It is to this last group of people that Jung speaks in convincing terms. He does not evade the difficult task of synthesizing his knowledge of the soul, gained in his many years of practice as a psychiatrist and analyst, into a fund of information available and applicable to everyone. He gives those clues to the nature and functioning of the psyche for which the modern man is painfully groping. The point of view he lays before us is a challenge to the spirit, and evokes an active response in everyone who has felt within himself an urge to grow beyond his inheritance. With one exception, all the essays which make up this volume have been delivered as lectures. The German texts of 4 of them have been brought out in separate publications, and the others are to be found in a volume together with several other essays which have already appeared in English. We are indebted to Mrs. Violet de Laszlo for many helpful suggestions in regard to the essay, Psychotherapists or the Clergy. Both Dr. Jung and Mrs. Jung have been kind enough to read and criticize the translations in part. Carrie F. Baines, Zurich, March 1933. Chapter 1. Dream Analysis in its Practical Application. The use of dream analysis in psychotherapy is still a much debated question. Many practitioners find it indispensable in the treatment of neuroses, and ascribe as much importance to the psychic activity manifested in dreams as to consciousness itself. Others, on the contrary, dispute the value of dream analysis and regard dreams as a negligible byproduct of the psyche. Obviously, if a person holds the view that the unconscious plays a leading role in the formation of neuroses, he will attribute practical significance to dreams as direct expressions of the unconscious. If, on the other hand, he denies the unconscious or thinks that it has no part in the development of neuroses, he will minimize the importance of dream analysis. It is regrettable that in this year of grace, 1931, more than half a century since Carus formulated the concept of the unconscious, over a century since Kant spoke of the immeasurable field of obscure ideas, and nearly 200 years since Leibniz postulated an unconscious psychic activity, not to mention the achievements of Genet, Flournoy, and Freud, that after all this, the actuality of the unconscious should still be a matter for controversy. Since it is my intention to deal exclusively with questions of practical treatment, I will not attempt in this place a defense of the hypothesis of the unconscious, though it is obvious enough that dream analysis stands or falls with this hypothesis. Without it, the dream appears to be merely a freak of nature, a meaningless conglomerate of memory fragments left over from the happenings of the day. Were the dream nothing more than this, there would be no excuse for the present discussion. We must recognize the unconscious if we are to treat of dream analysis at all, for we do not resort to it as a mere exercise of the wits, but as a method for uncovering hitherto unconscious psychic contents which are causally related to the neurosis and therefore of importance in its treatment. Anyone who deems this hypothesis unacceptable must simply rule out the question of the practicability of dream analysis. But since, according to our hypothesis, the unconscious plays a causal part in the neurosis, and since dreams are the direct expression of unconscious psychic activity, the attempt to analyze and interpret dreams is entirely justified from a scientific standpoint. Quite apart from therapeutic results, we may expect this line of endeavor to give us scientific insight into psychic causality. For the practitioner, however, scientific discoveries can at most be a gratifying byproduct of his efforts in the field of therapy. He will not feel called upon to apply dream analysis to his patients on the chance that it may throw light upon the problem of psychic causality. He may believe, of course, that the insight so gained is of therapeutic value, in which case he will regard dream analysis as one of his professional duties. It is well known that the Freudian school is of the opinion that important therapeutic effects are achieved by throwing light upon the unconscious causal factors, that is, by explaining them to the patient and thus making him conscious of the sources of his trouble. If we assume for the time being that this expectation is borne out by the facts, we can restrict ourselves to the questions whether or not dream analysis enables us to discover the unconscious causes of the neurosis, and whether it can do this unaided or must be used in conjunction with other methods. The Freudian answer, I may assume, is common knowledge, My own experience confirms this view inasmuch as I have found that dreams, not infrequently, bring to light in an unmistakable way the unconscious contents that are causal factors in a neurosis. Most often, it is the initial dreams that do this. I mean, those dreams that a patient reports at the very outset of a treatment. An illustration will perhaps be helpful. I was consulted by a man who held a prominent position in the world. He was afflicted with a sense of anxiety and insecurity and complained of dizziness, sometimes resulting in nausea, of a heavy head and difficulty in breathing, this being an exact description of the symptoms of mountain sickness. He had had an unusually successful career and had risen with the help of ambition, industry, and native talent from a humble origin as the son of a poor peasant. Step by step he had climbed, attaining at last an important post that offered him every opportunity for further social advancement. He had actually reached a place in life from which he could have begun his ascent into the upper regions when suddenly his neurosis intervened. At this point of his story, the patient could not refrain from that stereotyped exclamation which begins with the familiar words, "And just now, when I—" The fact that he had all the symptoms of mountain sickness was highly appropriate to the peculiar situation in which he found himself. He had brought with him to the consultation 2 dreams of the preceding night. The first dream was as follows. I am once more in the small village where I was born. Some peasant boys who went to school with me are standing together in the street. I walk past them, pretending not to know them. I hear one of them, who is pointing at me, say, "He doesn't often come back to our village." No tricks of interpretation are needed to recognize and to understand the allusion to the humble beginnings of the dreamer's career. The dream says quite clearly, "You forget how far down you began." Here is the second dream. I am in a great hurry because I am going on a journey. I hunt up my baggage but cannot find it. Time flies, and the train will soon be leaving. Finally, I succeed in getting all my things together. I hurry along the street, discover that I have forgotten a briefcase containing important papers, dash breathlessly back again, find it at last, and then run towards the station, but make hardly any headway. With a final effort, I rush onto the platform, only to find the train steaming out into the yards. It is very long and runs in a curious S-shaped curve. It occurs to me that if the driver is not careful and puts on full steam when he comes to the straight stretch, the rear coaches will still be on the curve and will be thrown over by the speed of the train. As a matter of fact, the driver opens the throttle as I try to shout. The rear coaches rock frightfully and are actually thrown off the rails. There is a terrible catastrophe. I awake in terror. Here, too, we can understand without much difficulty the situation represented by the dream. It pictures the patient's frantic haste to advance himself still further. Since the driver at the front of the train goes thoughtlessly ahead, the coaches behind him rock and finally overturn. That is, a neurosis is developed. It is clear that, at this period of life, the patient had reached the highest point of his career, that the effort of the long ascent from his lowly origin had exhausted his strength. He should have contented himself with his achievements, but instead he is driven by his ambition to attempt to scale heights of success for which he is not fitted. The neurosis came upon him as a warning. Circumstances prevented my treating the patient, and my view of his case did not satisfy him. The upshot was that events ran their course in the way indicated by the dream. He tried to exploit the professional openings that tempted his ambition, and ran so violently off the track that the train wreck was realized in actual life. The patient's anamnesis permitted the inference that the mountain sickness pointed to his inability to climb any further. The inference is confirmed by his dreams, which present this inability as a fact. we here come upon a characteristic of dreams that must take first place in any discussion of the applicability of dream analysis to the treatment of neuroses. The dream gives a true picture of the subjective state, while the conscious mind denies that this state exists, or recognizes it only grudgingly. The patient's conscious ego could see no reason why he should not go steadily forward. He continued his struggle for advancement, refusing to admit the fact which subsequent events made all too plain, that he was actually at the end of his tether. When, in such cases, we listen to the dictates of the conscious mind, we are always in doubt. We can draw opposite conclusions from the patient's anamnesis. After all, the private soldier may carry a marshal's baton in his knapsack, and many a son of poor parents has achieved the highest success. Why should it not be so in my patient's case? Since my judgment is fallible, why should my own conjecture be more dependable than his? At this point, the dream comes in as the expression of an involuntary psychic process not controlled by the conscious outlook. It presents the subjective state as it really is. It has no respect for my conjectures or for the patient's views as to how things should be, but simply tells how the matter stands. I have therefore made it a rule to put dreams on a plane with physiological fact. If sugar appears in the urine, then the urine contains sugar, and not albumin or urobilin or something else that I may have been led to expect. This is to say that I take dreams as facts that are invaluable for diagnosis. It is the way of dreams to give us more than we ask, and this is true of those I have just cited as illustrations. They not only allowed us an insight into the causes of the neurosis, but afforded a prognosis as well. What is more, they showed us at what point the treatment should begin. The patient must be prevented from going full steam ahead. This is precisely what he tells himself in the dream. For the time being, we will content ourselves with this hint and return to the question whether dreams enable us to explain the causes of a neurosis. I have cited 2 dreams that actually do this, but I could equally cite any number of initial dreams which do nothing of the kind, although they are perfectly transparent. I do not wish for the present to consider dreams which call for searching analysis and interpretation. The point is that there are neuroses whose actual origins we discover only at the very end of an analysis, and there are also cases in which it is of no benefit to have discovered the origin of the neurosis. This brings me back to the Freudian view, mentioned above, that for the purposes of therapy, it is necessary for the patient to become conscious of the causal factors in his disturbance, a view that is little more than a survival of the old theory of the trauma. I do not, of course, deny that many neuroses have a traumatic origin. I simply contest the notion that all neuroses are of this nature and arise without exception from some crucial experience of childhood. This view of the question results in a causalistic approach. The doctor must give his whole attention to the patient's past. He must always ask, why, and neglect the equally pertinent question, what for? This is frequently very harmful to the patient, for he is forced to search in his memory, perhaps over a course of years, for a hypothetical event in his childhood, while things of immediate importance are grossly neglected. A purely causalistic approach is too narrow to do justice to the true significance either of the dream or of the neurosis. A person is biased who turns to dreams for the sole purpose of discovering the hidden cause of the neurosis, for he leaves aside the larger part of the dream's actual contribution. The dreams I have cited unmistakably present the etiological factors in the neurosis, but it is clear that they also offer a prognosis or anticipation of the future and a suggestion as to the course of treatment as well. We must furthermore bear in mind that a great many dreams do not touch upon the causes of the neurosis, but treat of quite different matters, among others, of the patient's attitude to the doctor. I should like to illustrate this by recounting 3 dreams of the same patient. She consulted 3 different analysts in turn, and at the beginning of each treatment, she had one of these dreams. Here is the first. I must cross the frontier into the next country, but no one can tell me where the boundary lies, and I cannot find it. The treatment which followed this dream was unsuccessful, and was soon broken off. The second dream is as follows. I must cross the frontier. It is a black night, and I cannot find the custom house. After a long search, I notice a small light far away, and suppose that the frontier lies over there. But in order to reach it, I must cross a valley and pass through a dark wood, in which I lose my sense of direction. Then I notice that someone is with me. This person suddenly clings to me like a madman, and I awake in terror. That treatment also was discontinued after a few weeks, the reason being that the patient was completely disoriented by the analyst's unconscious identification with her. The third dream took place when the patient came into my hands. It runs, I must cross a frontier, or rather, I have already crossed it and find myself in a Swiss custom house. I have only a handbag with me, and believe that I have nothing to declare. But the customs official dives into my bag and, to my astonishment, pulls out 2 full-sized mattresses. The patient married during the course of her treatment with me, but not without a violent resistance to this step. The cause of her neurotic resistance came to light only after many months, and there is not a hint of it anywhere in these dreams. They are without exception anticipations of the difficulties she is to have with the analysts to whom she has come for treatment. I could cite many other dreams to the same effect, but these may suffice to show that dreams can be anticipatory and, in that case, must lose their particular meaning if they are treated in a purely causalistic way. These dreams give clear information about the analytical situation, and it is extremely important for the purposes of therapy that this be rightly understood. The first doctor understood the situation and sent the patient to the second. Here she drew her own conclusions from her dream and decided to leave. My interpretation of her third dream disappointed her greatly, but she was distinctly encouraged to go on in spite of all difficulties by the fact that it reported the frontier already crossed. Initial dreams are often amazingly transparent and clear-cut, but as the work of an analysis progresses, the dreams in a little while cease to be clear. If they should prove exceptional and keep their clarity, we can be sure that the analysis has as yet not touched some important part of the personality. As a rule, the dreams become less transparent and more blurred shortly after the beginning of the treatment. It becomes increasingly difficult to interpret them. A further reason for this being that a point may soon be reached where the doctor is unable, if the truth be told, to understand the situation as a whole. This is how the matter really stands, for to say that the dreams are unintelligible is a mere reflection of the doctor's subjective opinion. Nothing is unclear to the understanding. It is only when we fail to understand that things appear unintelligible and confused. In themselves, dreams are clear. That is, they are just as they must be under the given conditions. If we look back at these unintelligible dreams from a later stage of the treatment, or from a distance of some years, we are often astounded at our own blindness. It is a fact that, as an analysis progresses, we come upon dreams that are strikingly obscure in comparison with the initial dreams. But the doctor should not be too sure that these later dreams are really confused, or be too hasty in accusing the patient of deliberate resistance. He would do better to take the fact as an indication of his own growing inability to understand the situation. The psychiatrist likewise is prone to call a patient confused, when he would do well to recognize the projection and admit his own confusion, for it is really his understanding that grows confused in the face of the patient's strange behavior. For the purposes of therapy, moreover, it is highly important for the analyst to admit his lack of understanding from time to time, for nothing is more unbearable for the patient than to be always understood. The latter, in any case, relies too much upon the mysterious insight of the doctor, and, by appealing to his professional vanity, lays a dangerous trap for him. By taking refuge in the doctor's self-confidence and profound understanding, the patient loses all sense of reality, falls into a stubborn transference, and retards the cure. Understanding is clearly a subjective process. It may be very one-sided, in that the physician understands while the patient does not. In such a case, the doctor sometimes feels it is his duty to convince the patient, and if the latter will not allow himself to be convinced, the doctor accuses him of resistance. When the understanding is all on my side, I find it advisable to stress my lack of understanding. It is relatively unimportant whether the doctor understands or not, but everything hangs on the patient's doing so. What is really needed is a mutual agreement which is the fruit of joint reflection. It is one-sided and therefore dangerous understanding for the doctor to prejudge the dream from the standpoint of a certain doctrine, and to make a pronouncement which may be theoretically sound, but does not win the patient's assent. Insofar as the pronouncement fails in this respect, it is incorrect in the practical sense, and it may also be incorrect in the sense that it anticipates and thereby cripples the actual development of the patient. We appeal only to the patient's brain if we try to inculcate a truth, but if we help him to grow up to this truth in the course of his own development, we have reached his heart, and this appeal goes deeper and acts with greater force. When the doctor's interpretation is based merely upon a one-sided theory or a preconceived opinion, his chances of convincing the patient or of achieving any therapeutic results depend chiefly upon suggestion. And let no one deceive himself as to the effects of suggestion. In itself, suggestion is not to be despised, but it has serious limitations and reacts upon the patient's independence of character in a very undesirable way. A practicing analyst may be supposed to believe in the significance and value of the widening of consciousness. I mean by this the procedure of bringing to light the parts of the personality which were previously unconscious and subjecting them to conscious discrimination and criticism. It is an undertaking which requires the patient to face his problems and taxes his powers of conscious judgment and decision. It is nothing less than a challenge to the ethical sense, a call to arms that must be answered by the whole personality. Therefore, with respect to personal development, the analytical approach is of a higher order than the methods of treatment based upon suggestion. This is a kind of magic that works in the dark and makes no ethical demands upon the personality. Methods of treatment based upon suggestion are deceptive makeshifts. They are incompatible with the principles of analytical therapy and should be avoided. But suggestion can, of course, be avoided only when the doctor is aware of the many doors through which it can enter. There remains in the best of circumstances enough, and more than enough, unconscious suggestion. The analyst who wishes to rule out conscious suggestion must consider any dream interpretation invalid that does not win the assent of the patient, and he must search until he finds a formulation that does. This is a rule which, I believe, must always be observed, especially in dealing with those dreams whose obscurity is evidence of lack of understanding on the part of the doctor as well as of the patient. The doctor should regard every dream as a new departure, as a source of information about unknown conditions concerning which he has as much to learn as the patient. It goes without saying that he should hold no preconceived opinions based upon a particular theory, but stand ready in every single case to construct a totally new theory of dreams. There is still a boundless opportunity for pioneer work in this field. The view that dreams are merely imaginary fulfillments of suppressed wishes has long ago been superseded. It is certainly true that there are dreams which embody suppressed wishes and fears, but what is there which the dream cannot on occasion embody? Dreams may give expression to ineluctable truths, to philosophical pronouncements, illusions, wild fantasies, memories, plans, anticipations, irrational experiences, even telepathic visions, and heaven knows what besides. One thing we ought never to forget. Almost the half of our lives is passed in a more or less unconscious state. The dream is specifically the utterance of the unconscious. We may call consciousness the daylight realm of the human psyche and contrast it with the nocturnal realm of unconscious psychic activity, which we apprehend as dreamlike fantasy. It is certain that consciousness consists not only of wishes and fears, but of vastly more than these, and it is highly probable that the unconscious psyche contains a wealth of contents and living forms equal to or even greater than does consciousness, which is characterized by concentration, limitation, and exclusion. This being the state of affairs, it is highly imperative that we should not pare down the meaning of a dream to fit some narrow doctrine. We must remember that there are not a few patients who imitate the technical or theoretical jargon of the doctor, and do this even in their dreams. No language exists that cannot be misused. It is hard to realize how badly we are fooled by the abuse of ideas. It even seems as if the unconscious had a way of strangling the physician in the coils of his own theory. All this being so, I leave theory aside as much as possible in analyzing dreams. We cannot, of course, dispense with theory entirely, for it is needed to make things intelligible. It is on the basis of theory, for instance, that I expect dreams to have a meaning. I cannot prove in every case that dreams are meaningful, for there are dreams that neither doctor nor patient understands, but I must regard them as hypothetically meaningful in order to find courage to deal with them at all. To say that dreams contribute in an important way to conscious knowledge, and that a dream which fails to do so is a dream which has not been properly interpreted, this too is a theoretical statement. But I must adopt this hypothesis in order to make it clear to myself why I analyze dreams. On the other hand, every hypothesis about the nature of the dream, its function and structure, is merely a rule of thumb and must be subject to constant modifications. We must never forget in dream analysis, even for a moment, that we move on treacherous ground where nothing is certain but uncertainty. A suitable warning to the dream interpreter, if only it were not so paradoxical, would be, do anything you like, only don't try to understand. When we take up an obscure dream, our first task is not to understand and interpret it, but to establish the context with minute care. What I have in mind is not a boundless sweep of free associations, starting from any and every image in the dream, but a careful and conscious illumination of those chains of association that are directly connected with particular images. Many patients have first to be educated to this task, for they resemble the doctor in their urgent desire to understand and to interpret offhand. This is particularly the case when they have already been educated, or rather miseducated, by their reading or by a previous analysis that went wrong. They give associations in accordance with a theory, that is, they try to understand and interpret, and thus they nearly always get stuck. Like the doctor, they wish at once to get behind the dream in the false belief that it is a mere facade concealing the true meaning. Perhaps we may call the dream a facade, but we must remember that the fronts of most houses by no means trick or deceive us, but on the contrary, follow the plan of the building and often betray its inner arrangement. The manifest dream picture is the dream itself and contains the latent meaning. If I find sugar in the urine, it is sugar, and not a facade that conceals albumin. When Freud speaks of the dream facade, he is really speaking not of the dream itself, but of its obscurity, and in so doing is projecting upon the dream his own lack of understanding. We say that the dream has a false front only because we fail to see into it. We would do better to say that we are dealing with something like a text that is unintelligible, not because it has a facade, but simply because we cannot read it. We do not have to get behind such a text in the first place, but must learn to read it. We shall best succeed in reading dreams by establishing their context. As already remarked, we shall not succeed with the help of free associations, any more than we could use that means to decipher a Hittite inscription. Free associations will help me to uncover all my own complexes, but for this purpose, I need not start from the dream. I might as well take a sentence in a newspaper or a keep out sign. If we associate freely to a dream, our complexes will turn up right enough, but we shall hardly ever discover the meaning of the dream. To do this, we must keep as close as possible to the dream images themselves. When a person has dreamed of a deal table, little is accomplished by his associating it with his writing desk, which is not made of deal. The dream refers expressly to a deal table. If at this point nothing occurs to the dreamer, his hesitation signifies that a particular darkness surrounds the dream image, and this is suspicious. We would expect him to have dozens of associations to a deal table, and when he cannot find a single one, this must have a meaning. In such cases, we should return again and again to the image. I say to my patients, suppose I had no idea what the words deal table mean. Describe this object and give me its history in such a way that I cannot fail to understand what sort of thing it is. We succeed in this way in establishing a good part of the context of that particular dream image. When we have done this for all the images in the dream, we are ready for the venture of interpretation. Every interpretation is hypothetical, for it is a mere attempt to read an unfamiliar text. An obscure dream taken by itself can rarely be interpreted with any certainty, so that I attach little importance to the interpretation of single dreams. With a series of dreams, we can have more confidence in our interpretations, for the later dreams correct the mistakes we have made in handling those that went before. We are also better able, in a dream series, to recognize the important contents and basic themes, and I therefore urge my patients to make a careful record of their dreams and the interpretations given them. I also show them how to work up their dreams in the way I have just indicated, so that they can bring me in writing the dream and the material that forms the context of the dream. In later stages of analysis, I let them work out the interpretations as well. The patient learns in this way how to consult the unconscious without the doctor's help. If dreams did nothing more than inform us about the causal factors in a neurosis, we could safely let the doctor handle them alone. My way of dealing with them, moreover, would be quite superfluous if all that we could expect of them were a collection of hints and insights helpful to the doctor. But since it is probable, as I have shown in a few examples, that dreams contain more than practical helps for the doctor, dream analysis deserves very special consideration. Sometimes, indeed, it is a matter of life and death. Among many cases of this sort, I have been especially impressed with one that concerned a colleague of mine in Zurich. He was a man somewhat older than myself, whom I saw from time to time, and who always teased me on these occasions about my interest in dream interpretation. I met him one day in the street, and he called out to me, "How are things going? Are you still interpreting dreams? By the way, I've had another idiotic dream. Does it mean something too?" He had dreamed as follows. I am climbing a high mountain over steep, snow-covered slopes. I mount higher and higher. It is marvelous weather. The higher I climb, the better I feel. I think, if only I could go on climbing like this forever. When I reach the summit, my happiness and elation are so strong that I feel I could mount right up into space, and I discover that I actually can do this. I go on climbing on empty air. I awake in a real ecstasy. When he had told me this dream, I said, "My dear man, I know you can't give up mountaineering, but let me implore you not to go alone from now on. When you go, take 2 guides, and you must promise on your word of honor to follow their directions." "Incorrigible," he replied, laughing, and said goodbye. I never saw him again. 2 months later came the first blow. When out alone, he was buried by an avalanche, but was dug out in the nick of time by a military patrol which happened to come along. 3 months after this, the end came. He went on a climb accompanied by a younger friend, but without guides. An alpinist standing below him saw him literally step into the air as he was letting himself down a rock wall. He fell onto the head of his friend, who was waiting beneath him, and both were dashed to pieces far below. That was ecstasis in the full meaning of the word. No amount of skepticism and critical reserve has ever enabled me to regard dreams as negligible occurrences. Often enough they appear senseless, but it is obviously we who lack the sense and the ingenuity to read the enigmatical message from the nocturnal realm of the psyche. When we see that at least a half of man's life is passed in this realm, that consciousness has its roots there, and that the unconscious operates in and out of waking existence, it would seem incumbent upon medical psychology to sharpen its perceptions by a systematic study of dreams. No one doubts the importance of conscious experience. Why then should we question the importance of unconscious happenings? They also belong to human life, and they are sometimes more truly a part of it, for weal or woe, than any events of the day. Dreams give information about the secrets of the inner life and reveal to the dreamer hidden factors of his personality. As long as these are undiscovered, they disturb his waking life and betray themselves only in the form of symptoms. This means that we cannot effectively treat the patient from the side of consciousness alone, but must bring about a change in and through the unconscious. As far as present knowledge goes, there is only one way of doing this. There must be a thoroughgoing conscious assimilation of unconscious contents. By assimilation, I mean a mutual interpenetration of conscious and unconscious contents, and not, as is too commonly thought, a one-sided valuation, interpretation, and deformation of unconscious contents by the conscious mind. As to the value and significance of unconscious contents in general, very mistaken views are abroad. It is well known that the Freudian school presents the unconscious in a thoroughly depreciatory light, just as also it looks on primitive man as little better than a wild beast. Its nursery tales about the terrible old man of the tribe and its teachings about the infantile perverse criminal, unconscious, have led people to make a dangerous monster out of the unconscious, that really very natural thing. As if all that is good, reasonable, beautiful, and worth living for had taken up its abode in consciousness. Have the horrors of the World War really not opened our eyes? Are we still unable to see that man's conscious mind is even more devilish and perverse than the unconscious? I was recently reproached with the charge that my teaching about the assimilation of the unconscious, were it accepted, would undermine culture and exalt primitivity at the cost of our highest values. Such an opinion can have no foundation other than the erroneous belief that the unconscious is a monster. Such a view arises from fear of nature and of life as it actually is. Freud has invented the idea of sublimation to save us from the imaginary claws of the unconscious. But what actually exists cannot be alchemistically sublimated, and if anything is apparently sublimated, it never was what a false interpretation took it to be. The unconscious is not a demonic monster, but a thing of nature that is perfectly neutral as far as moral sense, aesthetic taste, and intellectual judgment go. It is dangerous only when our conscious attitude towards it becomes hopelessly false, and this danger grows in the measure that we practice repressions. But as soon as the patient begins to assimilate the contents that were previously unconscious, the danger from the side of the unconscious diminishes. As the process of assimilation goes on, it puts an end to the disassociation of the personality and to the anxiety that attends and inspires the separation of the two realms of the psyche. That which my critic feared, I mean the overwhelming of consciousness by the unconscious, is most likely to occur when the unconscious is excluded from life by repressions or is misunderstood and depreciated. A fundamental mistake, and one which is commonly made, is this. It is supposed that the contents of the unconscious are unequivocal and are marked with plus or minus signs that are immutable. As I see the question, this view is too naive. The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains itself in equilibrium as the body does. Every process that goes too far immediately and inevitably calls forth a compensatory activity. Without such adjustments, a normal metabolism would not exist, nor would the normal psyche. We can take the idea of compensation, so understood, as a law of psychic happening. Too little on one side results in too much on the other. The relation between conscious and unconscious is compensatory. This fact, which is easily verifiable, affords a rule for dream interpretation. It is always helpful, when we set out to interpret a dream, to ask, what conscious attitude does it compensate? Although compensation may take the form of imaginary wish fulfillment, it generally presents itself as an actuality, which becomes the more strikingly actual, the more we try to repress it. We know that we do not conquer thirst by repressing it. The dream content is to be taken in all seriousness as something that has actually happened to us. It should be treated as a contributory factor in framing our conscious outlook. If we do not do this, we shall keep that one-sided conscious attitude which evoked the unconscious compensation in the first place. But this way holds little hope of our ever judging ourselves correctly or finding any balance in life. If anyone should set out to replace his conscious outlook by the dictates of the unconscious, and this is the prospect which my critics find so alarming, he would only succeed in repressing the former, and it would reappear as an unconscious compensation. The unconscious would thus have changed its face and completely reversed its position. It would have become timidly reasonable, in striking contrast to its former tone. It is not generally believed that the unconscious operates in this way, yet such reversals constantly take place and constitute its essential function. This is why every dream is a source of information and a means of self-regulation, and why dreams are our most effective aids in the task of building up the personality. The unconscious itself does not harbor explosive materials, but it may become explosive owing to the repressions exercised by a self-sufficient or cowardly conscious outlook. All the more reason, then, for giving heed to that side. It should now be clear why I have made it a practical rule always to ask, before trying to interpret a dream, what conscious attitude does it compensate? As may be seen, I thus bring the dream into the closest possible connection with the conscious state. I even maintain that it is impossible to interpret a dream with any degree of certainty unless we know what the conscious situation is. For it is only in the light of this knowledge that we can make out whether the unconscious content carries a plus or minus sign. The dream is not an isolated psychic event completely cut off from daily life. If it seems so to us, that is only an illusion that arises from our lack of understanding. In reality, the relation between consciousness and the dream is strictly causal, and they interact in the subtlest of ways. I should like to show with the help of an illustration how important it is to find the true value of unconscious contents. A young man brought me the following dream. My father is driving away from the house in his new car. He drives very clumsily, and I get very excited about his apparent stupidity. He goes this way and that, forward and backward, repeatedly getting the car into a tight place. Finally, he runs into a wall and badly damages the car. I shout at him in a perfect rage, telling him he ought to behave himself. My father only laughs, and then I see that he is dead drunk. There is no foundation in fact for the dream. The dreamer is convinced that his father would never behave in that way, even if he were drunk. The dreamer himself is used to cars. He is a careful driver, and very moderate in the use of alcohol, especially when he has to drive. Bad driving, and even slight injuries to the car, irritate him greatly. The son's relation to his father is good. He admires him for being an unusually successful man. We can say, without any attempt at interpretation, that the dream presents a very unfavorable picture of the father. What, then, should we take its meaning to be as far as the son is concerned? Is his relation to his father good only in appearance, and does it really consist of overcompensated resistances? If this is so, we should attribute a plus sign to the dream content. We should have to tell the young man, this is your actual relation to your father. But since I could find nothing equivocal or neurotic in the facts about the son's relation to his father, I had no warrant for disturbing the young man's feelings with such a destructive pronouncement. To do so would have prejudiced the outcome of the treatment. But if his relation to his father is really excellent, why must the dream manufacture such an improbable story to discredit the father? The dreamer's unconscious must have a distinct tendency to produce such a dream. Has the young man resistances to his father after all, which are perhaps fed by jealousy or a certain sense of inferiority? But before we go out of our way to burden his conscience, and with sensitive young people there is always the risk that we do this too lightly, we had better for once drop the question of why he had this dream, and ask ourselves instead, what for? The answer in this case would be that his unconscious clearly tries to depreciate his father. If we take this as a compensation, we are forced to the conclusion that his relation to his father is not only good, but even too good. The young man actually deserves the French sobriquet of son of dad. His father is still too much the guarantor of his existence, and he is still living what I call a provisional life. He runs the risk of failing to realize himself because there is too much father on every side. This is why the unconscious manufactures a kind of blasphemy. It seeks to lower the father and to elevate the son. An immoral business, we may be tempted to say. Every father who lacks insight would be on his guard here. And yet, this compensation is entirely to the point. It forces the son to contrast himself with his father, and that is the only way in which he can become aware of himself. The interpretation just outlined was apparently the correct one, for it struck home. It won the spontaneous assent of the young man, and did no violence to his feeling for his father, or to the father's feeling for him. But this interpretation was only possible when the father-son relation had been studied in the light of all the facts that were accessible to consciousness. Without a knowledge of the conscious situation, the true meaning of the dream would have remained in doubt. It is of the first importance for the assimilation of dream contents that no violence be done to the real values of the conscious personality. If the conscious personality is destroyed or even crippled, there is no one left to do the assimilating. When we recognize the importance of the unconscious, we are not embarking upon a Bolshevist experiment which puts the lowest on top. This would only bring about a return of the situation we are trying to correct. We must see to it that the conscious personality remains intact, for we can only turn the unconscious compensations to good account when the conscious personality cooperates in the venture. When it comes to the assimilation of a content, it is never a question of this or that, but of this and that. Just as the interpretation of dreams requires exact knowledge of the conscious status quo, so the treatment of dream symbolism demands that we take into account the dreamer's philosophical, religious, and moral convictions. It is far wiser in practice not to regard the dream symbols as signs or symptoms of a fixed character. We should rather take them as true symbols, that is to say, as expressions of something not yet consciously recognized or conceptually formulated. In addition to this, they must be considered in relation to the dreamer's immediate state of consciousness. I emphasize that this way of treating the dream symbols is advisable in practice because theoretically there do exist relatively fixed symbols whose meaning must on no account be referred to anything whose content is known, or to anything that can be formulated in concepts. If there were no relatively fixed symbols, it would be impossible to determine the structure of the unconscious. There would be nothing in it which could be in any way laid hold of or described. It may seem strange that I should attribute an indefinite content to the relatively fixed symbols, but it is the indefinite content that marks the symbol as against the mere sign or symptom. It is well known that the Freudian school operates with hard and fast sexual symbols, but these are just what I should call signs, for they are made to stand for sexuality, and this is supposed to be something definitive. As a matter of fact, Freud's concept of sexuality is thoroughly elastic, and so vague that it can be made to include almost anything. The word itself is familiar, but what it denotes amounts to an indeterminable or variable X that stands for the physiological activity of the glands at one extreme and the highest reaches of the spirit at the other. Instead of taking a dogmatic stand that rests upon the illusion that we know something because we have a familiar word for it, I prefer to regard the symbol as the announcement of something unknown, hard to recognize and not to be fully determined. Take, for example, the so-called phallic symbols, which are supposed to stand for the membrum virile and nothing more. Psychologically speaking, the membrum is itself, as Cranefeld has recently pointed out, a symbolic image whose wider content cannot easily be determined. As was customary throughout antiquity, primitive people today make a free use of phallic symbols, yet it never occurs to them to confuse the phallus, as a ritualistic symbol, with the penis. They always take the phallus to mean the creative mana, the power of healing and fertility, that which is unusually potent, to use Lehmann's expression. Its equivalents in mythology and in dreams are the bull, the ass, the pomegranate, the yoni, the he-goat, the lightning, the horse's hoof, the dance, the magical cohabitation in the furrow, and the menstrual fluid, to mention only a few of many. That which underlies all of these images, and sexuality itself, is an archetypal content that is hard to grasp, and that finds its best psychological expression in the primitive mana symbol. In each of the images given above, we can see a relatively fixed symbol, that is, the mana symbol, but we cannot, for all that, be certain that when they occur in dreams, they have no other meaning. The practical need may call for quite another interpretation. To be sure, if we had to interpret dreams in an exhaustive way according to scientific principles, we should have to refer every such symbol to an archetype. But in practice, this kind of interpretation might be a grave blunder, for the patient's psychological state may require anything rather than the giving of attention to a theory of dreams. It is therefore advisable, for the purposes of therapy, to look for the meaning of symbols as they relate to the conscious situation. In other words, to treat them as if they were not fixed. This is as much as to say that we must renounce all preconceived opinions, however knowing they make us feel, and try to discover the meaning of things for the patient. If we do this, our interpretations will obviously not go very far towards satisfying a theory of dreams. In fact, they may fall very short in this respect. But if the practitioner operates too much with fixed symbols, there is danger of his falling into mere routine and dogmatism, thus failing to meet the patient's need. It is unfortunate that, to illustrate the above, I should have to go into greater detail than space here permits. But I have elsewhere published illustrative material that amply supports my statements. As already remarked, it frequently happens at the very beginning of a treatment that a dream reveals to the doctor, in a wide perspective, the general direction in which the unconscious is moving. But for practical reasons, it may not be feasible to make clear to the patient, at this early stage, the deeper meaning of his dream. The demands of therapy are binding upon us in this way also. When the doctor gains a far-reaching insight, it is thanks to his experience in the matter of relatively fixed symbols. Such insight can be of the very greatest value in diagnosis and in prognosis as well. I was once consulted in the case of a 17-year-old girl. One specialist had suggested that she might be in the first stages of progressive atrophy of the muscles, while another thought that she was a hysteric. Because of this second opinion, I was called in. The clinical picture made me suspect an organic disease, but the girl showed traits of hysteria as well. I asked for dreams. The patient answered at once. Yes, I have terrible dreams. Just recently I dreamed I was coming home at night. Everything is as quiet as death. The door into the living room is half open, and I see my mother hanging from the chandelier and swinging to and fro in a cold wind that blows in through the open windows. At another time, I dreamed that a terrible noise breaks out in the house at night. I go to see what has happened and find that a frightened horse is tearing through the rooms. At last it finds the door into the hall and jumps through the hall window from the 4th floor down into the street. I was terrified to see it lying below, all mangled. The way in which these dreams allude to death is enough to give one pause, but many persons have anxiety dreams now and then. We must therefore look more closely into the meaning of the outstanding symbols mother and horse. These figures must be equivalent one to the other, for they both do the same thing. They commit suicide. The mother symbol is archetypal and refers to a place of origin, to nature, that which passively creates, hence to substance and matter, to material nature, the lower body, womb, and the vegetative functions. It connotes also the unconscious, natural, and instinctive life, the physiological realm, the body in which we dwell or are contained, for the mother is also a vessel, the hollow form, uterus, that carries and nourishes, and it thus stands for the foundations of consciousness. Being within something or contained in something suggests darkness, the nocturnal, a state of anxiety. With these allusions, I am presenting the idea of the mother in many of its mythological and etymological transformations. I am also giving an important part of the yin concept of Chinese philosophy. All this is dream content, but it is not something which the 17-year-old girl has acquired in her individual existence. It is rather a bequest from the past. On the one hand, it has been kept alive by the language, and on the other hand, it is inherited with the structure of the psyche and is therefore to be found in all times and among all peoples. The familiar word mother refers apparently to the best known of mothers in particular, to my mother. But the mother symbol points to a darker meaning which eludes conceptual formulation and can only be vaguely apprehended as the hidden, nature-bound life of the body. Yet even this expression is too narrow and excludes too many pertinent side meanings. The psychic reality which underlies this symbol is so inconceivably complex that we can only discern it from afar off, and then but very dimly. It is such realities that call for symbolic expression. If we apply our findings to the dream, its meaning will be, the unconscious life destroys itself. That is the dream's message to the conscious mind of the dreamer and to everyone who has ears to hear. Horse is an archetype that is widely current in mythology and folklore. As an animal, it represents the non-human psyche. the subhuman animal side, and therefore the unconscious. This is why the horse in folklore sometimes sees visions, hears voices, and speaks. As a beast of burden, it is closely related to the mother archetype. The Valkyries bear the dead hero to Valhalla, and the Trojan horse encloses the Greeks. As an animal lower than man, it represents the lower part of the body, and the animal drives that take their rise from there. The horse is dynamic power and a means of locomotion. It carries one away like a surge of instinct. It is subject to panics like all instinctive creatures who lack higher consciousness. Also, it has to do with sorcery and magical spells, especially the black night horse, which heralds death. It is evident, then, that horse is the equivalent of mother with a slight shift of meaning. The mother stands for life at its origin, and the horse for the merely animal life of the body. If we apply this meaning to the dream, it says, the animal life destroys itself. The two dreams make nearly the same assertion, but as is usually the case, the second is more specific. The peculiar subtlety of the dream is brought out in both instances. There is no mention of the death of the individual. It is notorious that one often dreams of one's own death, but that is no serious matter. When it is really a question of death, the dream speaks another language. Both of these dreams, then, point to a serious and even fatal organic disease. The prognosis was shortly after borne out in fact. As for the relatively fixed symbols, this example gives a fair idea of their general nature. There are a great many of them, and they may differ in individual cases by subtle shifts of meaning. It is only through comparative studies in mythology, folklore, religion, and language that we can determine these symbols in a scientific way. The evolutionary stages through which the human psyche has passed are more clearly discernible in the dream than in consciousness. The dream speaks in images and gives expression to instincts that are derived from the most primitive levels of nature. Consciousness all too easily departs from the law of nature, but it can be brought again into harmony with the latter by the assimilation of unconscious contents. By fostering this process, we lead the patient to the rediscovery of the law of his own being. I have not been able, in so short a space, to deal with anything but the elements of the subject. I could not put together before your eyes, stone by stone, the edifice that is reared in every analysis from the materials of the unconscious and finds its completion in the restoration of the total personality. The way of successive assimilations reaches far beyond the curative results that specifically concern the doctor. It leads in the end to that distant goal, which may perhaps have been the first urge to life, the bringing into reality of the whole human being, that is, individuation. We physicians are without doubt the first scientific observers of these obscure processes of nature. As a rule, we see only a pathological phase of the development and lose sight of the patient as soon as he is cured. But it is only when the cure has been effected that we are in a position to study the normal process of change, itself a matter of years or decades. If we had some knowledge of the ends towards which unconscious psychic growth is tending, and if our psychological insight were not drawn exclusively from the pathological phase, we should have a less confused idea of the processes revealed by dreams and a clearer recognition of what it is that the symbols point to. In my opinion, every doctor should be aware of the fact that psychotherapy in general, and analysis in particular, is a procedure that breaks into a purposeful and continuous development, now here and now there, and thus singles out particular phases which may seem to follow opposing courses. Since every analysis by itself shows only one part or aspect of the deeper course of development, nothing but hopeless confusion can result from casuistic comparisons. For this reason, I have preferred to confine myself to the rudiments of the subject and to practical considerations.